All right, there we go. I think we're back.
All right.
All right. Thank you all so much for your patience. I hope you had a refreshing 5, maybe more minutes. I don't know time. That's what happens. I'm a poetry person, just kind of floating around half the time. I'm so excited to introduce our next reader for this evening, because if you open up your beautiful books and take a peek at the introduction, you're going to see that our next reader wrote this really beautiful introduction to Maryan's work. And so thank you so much, Brittanie. It means so much to us when people like give us this gift of an introduction for a chapbook, and it means so much that you are a part of this beautiful book. Without further ado, I'll properly introduce you. Let me make sure you get a spotlight. For Claire, you got it. Thank you. Brittanie Sterner is the author of the chapbook We Were Calling You All Night from the Roof, and her poems exploring death, travel, and queerness have been published in various places. She currently serves as the program director for the One Book, One Philadelphia project at the Free Library. Thank you so much for joining us, Brittanie.
Oh my gosh, thank you, Anar. And it's such a delight to be a Philadelphia satellite in this amazing, super talented Austin crew. And it's so nice to see everyone and hear these incredible poems. My brain is buzzing, and this has been beautiful. And yeah, I just want to say happy birthday to 16 Rabbits and to Maryan, early happy birthday. And just how incredible it's been to see the life of these poems over the years. I've seen some of them take so many different shapes and formats and lengths. And I think it's like just such a testament to Maryan's commitment to evolving something and to, you know, that process of like continually pushing something and staying curious with it. So it's amazing. It's like a crystallization of this like all this radical living and loving, and it's a gift, Maryan. So thank you for this book, and thank you for the incredible. Now I'll be singing my sorry everyone, my Spotify came Anyways, it was a huge honor to write the introduction for this book. And I'm actually not going to read any poems today. I'm just going to read the intro and use my spot as an opportunity to give Maryan more of the flowers that she deserves, and have this chance to talk about the book. So Maryan and I have set out many times to traverse some piece of the vast country called America, to sleep in tent or van, wake early to taste local rain, stand in awe of the broadside of a buffalo. On one of these trips, we mapped a new America, breaking its expanse of culture and psychogeography into 13 countries with new names. What a strange and delicious entitlement it was to redistribute the incomprehensible hugeness from a moving car, our own speck in the landscape of a history unfolding. The new map was Maryan's idea, and Brian was there too. The examination of place and one's place in that place, and so home and the longing for it, is a river running through her truly stunning second collection of poems. Meditations of a Traveler wander from Philadelphia to Cairo, suburban PA to Hanoi, upstate New York to Lisbon to Austin to Guanajuato. Together, they recontextualize place through portals of memory and dream that collapse distance. They mix time up and return it to its natural chaos, asking what it means for the body to carry the memories of many places at once. Of course, we can never step in the same river twice. That continuous newness, the feeling of always arriving, is invoked in these poems through the surreal. In Meditation Through the American South, a reshaping of a road trip we took together from Philly to Austin, ordinary animals are angels taking flight amongst gem mines and ghost ships. And I don't remember exactly seeing those things, but in reading the poem, I certainly remember feeling them. The portals of memory and dream link one poem to another as both entrance and exit. In Meditation in York, Pennsylvania, there's a door to a tender and buoyant grandmother in Cairo. In Tarab, another portal to Cairo, is the voice of famed artist Kulthum, which sweetens the sour molasses of longing and lives in the chords of every mother and child. In the lake at Pinchot Park, a poem that aches with being in the wrong place. A lake becomes an immediate portal to the sea. The Red Sea, which in Meditation in Sharm Sheikh, a lost uncle crawls out of, aglow with a supernatural vigor. The sea also linked to higher power in Meditation in Guanajuato, Mexico, when after nearly drowning in the Pacific on Christmas Eve, the speaker hears the voice of God. It was clear and loud and sounded like my own voice. Earlier, though, she writes, but the sea doesn't want. Desire is a human trait. I use the word wander, but it's clear that the poet is on a search, following a very specific curiosity, a reverent desire from the belly made of both movement and stillness. There's an inner child wonderment with and shaping of God, that deepest portal. We meet the ancient child from the jump in the first poem's image of the young girl swatting the dirt with a branch, and see her playfulness and earnestness again and again in reminders of enchantment with ordinary life. This life is enchanted, even the vulgar bits. Yet there's nothing simple or complete about the search. In Our Lady of Zaitun, God is a burial chamber inscribed in relief and ill-tempered womb throbbing, which I think is my favorite line in the whole book. At once an entrance and exit. Throughout the book, the speaker's relationship with God is framed by origins of religious persecution and displacement alongside traumas of natural disaster. But in her portal jumping and remapping of place, the poet holds space for trauma. At the same time, muddies the seawater and complicates narratives of immigration, diaspora, and the trauma of collective knowing by reckoning with her own denial. She writes, I wonder how far we'd push it. I didn't say, turn back, echoing unintentional participation in colonial practices via the complexity of American privilege, despite not being able to feel safe anywhere. Simultaneous truths converge in the title poem, which carefully braids this knowledge with refrains of earlier lines. In their repetition, they gain new meaning and allow for multiple realities to coexist. Maryan always says two things, both embodied in the secret chambers of this book. See in the future, and the future isn't real. Accordingly, beautifully, 16 Rabbits is a book of both ands, one that ends with notes of mutuality and gratitude cultivated in the city she has made her home. I am forever and ever, amen, grateful to know this both and human by reading her. Thank you, Maryan, for the opportunity to add something to this, and congratulations on your beautiful book.
Brittanie, that is a stunning introduction. I've read it many times. I helped edit it, and I still am so surprised by just how much insight and depth it has in such a short amount of space on the page. So yeah, thank you so much for gifting us that introduction. And it is a gorgeous accompaniment to this work. And I think really explores it with great insight. So that brings us to the rabbit of the hour. I am so excited to hear Maryan read these poems because, as we all know, they totally take a different shape and body when read by the poet themselves, as opposed to reading them on the page. And especially as an editor, getting my little Cheeto fingers all over them through the past 6 months. It doesn't taint the experience, but it definitely changes it. So I am so excited to hear you, Maryan, express this art in your own unique fashion. And so with that, I will introduce Maryan Nagy Captan. She is a poet, screenwriter, and educator living in Austin, Texas. She is a 2021 graduate of the Michener Center for Writers and attended the Disquiet International Literary Conference in 2017 and 2019. Her first book, Copy Body, was published in 2017 by Empty Set Press, and her second book, 16 Rabbits, is the spring 2021 winner of the Host Publications Chapbook Prize and is now available from Host Publications and Malvern Books. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Maryan. Welcome.
Hello. I tried to set the mood with a fancy light that matches the book. So I hope it's working. First, I'm just awestruck by how much love and support and wonder I feel after hearing everybody read, and also just all of the kind of affection I feel coming from this strange digital world that we live in. I feel like I'm being hugged, even though I'm by myself in this room right now. So thank you to everyone in this digital space. And thank you to everybody who pre-ordered the book and kind of took a chance with this very mysterious cover, which is my favorite cover of all time. And thank you to Anar and Claire and Joe. I have only good things to say. I mean, I don't know how else, I feel like I've used every compliment I can come up with. I am just so grateful that we came together in this way to create what feels like a truly collaborative project. So this isn't really just my book. This is all of our books, including Molly and Gabby and Rob, who were in workshops while these poems were coming together and watched me kind of stumble my way through a lot of these feelings, because the title poem, the title poem is a poem that I wrote for a class that we all had together with Natasha Trethewey. And I remember I was so scared, so scared to share that poem, because it was just so raw and naked and intimate, and I couldn't make it through. I burst into tears halfway through and I had to turn my camera off, and Natasha ended up reading the rest of it on my behalf. And I am really grateful for that class, because Natasha was just like, did not coddle us in any way, and really encouraged us to sit in our feelings. And I wrote the best poems I think I've ever written in that class. And Gabby, Molly, and Rob were instrumental in shaping the final drafts of these, because they're just brilliant. I'm sure it's easy to tell just from hearing their work. Yeah, so I guess I'll start reading. I have a list. There's 16 poems, hence the title 16 Rabbits. And so I've picked out 6. There's a chance I'll do an encore, maybe a little karaoke. We'll see how the time pans out. And I was rehearsing and reading through these poems. Bongos. Maybe I'll play the bongos. Who knows? If you listen to the podcast, you would know. That's my plug, the Host Dispatch. And my mom is watching. Ahlan ya mama. I told her I'd shout her out. So I am going to try to honor my emotions, because these poems are deeply, deeply felt, and they still have an emotional impact on me when I read them. And I want everybody to embrace the fact that I will likely cry, and that it is part of the experience of this collection. Is these poems are very much me, and always. It is very naked. And I feel when the pre-orders went up, some of my coworkers were ordering it, which I was so grateful for. But I was also like, these people don't really know me, but they're about to like really know me in a way that's like much deeper than most people. And yeah, so these poems are very emotional for me, and I do get choked up, and I didn't want to overwork them in terms of how they're read. And so if seeing somebody get emotional makes you uncomfortable, I encourage that you sit with that feeling and kind of examine it, and wish me luck. Maybe I won't cry. I might just laugh through the whole book. We'll see what happens. This first poem is a poem for my sister, Georgina, who is my muse, and she challenges me, and she's so smart, and she looks exactly like me, and a lot of people confuse us. So she might play me in a biopic one day, who knows? Probably not. But this is called Meditation in York, Pennsylvania. It is on page 5, if you're interested in reading along. Yeah, here we go. Meditation in York, Pennsylvania, for Georgina. In Pennsylvania, a crow caws big. It stretches a worm until it splits. The trees are all willows, their branches weeping. I don't remember trees like this in Cairo, or even the color pink. Just dusk and a dried palm leaf. Sound of the wind. Sound of the wind through the dried palm leaves, a zigzag of skyline and cars. A million cars everywhere, and more than a million people bumbling into the night. In Pennsylvania, there's a door that's a portal. It leads to a Cairo where Kulthum spirals down the staircase and the zigzag skyline sits framed. The scent of cumin, of incense and myrrh fills each room and transports us through the photo albums of early childhood and into the arms of our grandmother, smiling in her polyester robe, so tender and buoyant. Yeah. That poem is really important to me because I really wanted to write something for my sister, because she is the only person that kind of has shared this experience with me, but she has such a different perspective of our childhood and of our kind of our immigration story. And that poem, I think, captures the pieces that we can agree on, which is outside of my parents' house in Dover, Pennsylvania. Dover is in York, is a totally different world than when you step inside and there's like this little Egypt in my parents' house. And I think a lot of immigrants can attest to that, or people who are the children of immigrants can attest to that. And yeah, this next poem is Meditation Through the American South, which is dedicated to our friend Michael, who is actually sitting next to Brittanie right now. You just can't see him, but I know he's there. And Brittanie, who read the introduction. I love this poem. This poem has probably taken like 70 different shapes, different versions, different iterations. And this is where we landed. And here we go. Meditation Through the American South for Michael and Brittanie. Gem mines, ghost ships, the dragonfly that hit the windshield so hard its eye exploded. Atlanta, we drove through. Chattanooga, a suggestion. In the woods of Montgomery, a monster truck rally dampened the mood. You loved it. In an RV park in Virginia, we watched angels take flight. A bird, a bat, a grasshopper, they lift. Mountain bodies flick their tails everywhere we look. Wild blueberries, ponderosa, we recollect our lives. I was stung 3 times and no one believed me. In City Park, we pressed our palms together to recite the Lord's Prayer over bodies of the dead. Frogs, but nevertheless. I played Shadowland in a cornfield alone, answered the dappled stalks, then heard your calls and came running. I prayed in that church and meant it. We all did. Okay, so I'm going to read Tarab, which is my poem for Kulthum. And if you know who she is, then you know. And if you know what Tarab means, then you know, but I'm gonna explain it. Kulthum is a phenomenon in Egypt. She is a very beloved and basically across the board, seen as the voice of Egypt. She was a singer and an activist and just incredible. There's a 40-minute song of hers and her band that's on the playlist, which I'm also plugging right now. And if you pre-ordered the book, then you got a little card and there's a QR code on the back. Just scan that, hop in the shower, sing along, whatever you want to do. And Tarab is the Arabic word, and it doesn't have an English translation. There's no equivalent, but it means kind of the ecstasy that one experiences when listening to music, when one is moved by music. And music is such a huge part of Egyptian culture and dance and kind of the expression of ecstatic joy. And I always equate it with prayer. And I think there's a lot of parallels between the experience of kind of singing a song that everyone you know also is singing or knows, and praying. So this poem is, to me, a prayer. I come to it again and again, and I remind myself of how kind of transformational music can be, and how it is the backbone of many communities that are oppressed or living in places in the world where they're being persecuted, and how music can be kind of a beacon for them. And us, I should say us, not just them, all of us. So this is Tarab for Kulthum. That time I heard you in a bar in Philadelphia, the turbine of your range, that undulating rhythm, all shisha trailing. I set down my drink and drank up your tonic, eyes closed, hypnotic, note by note, your voice sweetens the sour molasses of longing, of poverty and rust. That feeling deepens now, transcendent. Sometimes the bar's so loud I can't find you, but in the Cairo of my memories, you're everywhere. Alive in the chords of every mother and child, all of us belonging to one another. Your mellow cooing grows louder now. I sway with the ghosts that held me, my grandmother's, maybe. She animates each limb into full-bodied reverie, tarab, full-bodied ecstasy, suspended from every note, a surprise. Yeah. So this book has a lot of levity in it. I feel like we've kind of covered a lot of the moments of levity, but it's also very deeply emotional. So this is where we enter the phase of the reading where there's less surprises and more just sad things. So be prepared. It's going to be great. I don't know about great, but I'm going to read a poem that's dedicated to my uncle. And this is one of the poems that I was really nervous about including in the book because it is so intimate to my family history. And today I called my mom and I was asking her to help me with making sure that I have the pronunciation right for one of the names that are listed in Arabic in this poem. And she told me that she'd read through the book. And so my parents emigrated to America with me and my sister when they were in their 30s. And my mom knew some English, but not very much. And my dad didn't speak the language at all. And so she read through the book and she was like, there's a lot I didn't understand. But what I did understand was that you wrote this entire book with your feelings. Like it is so clear that it's you on the page without any kind of like pretenses, and you're not really evading. And I was like, thank you for saying that. That's so sweet. And she's like, and I saw the poem that you wrote for my brother, who is my uncle in this poem. And she said, and I was worried because I was like, this is like family history that is not necessarily my story to tell. And she said, I'm really glad you included this because this is part of your story too. And she basically gave me my blessing and her blessing, I should say, not my blessing. She gave me her blessing to read this poem. And I don't feel afraid to share any of the poems anymore because my sister said everything was cool and my mom said everything's cool. And my dad said it's cool. So I have permission now. This poem is called Meditation in Sharm el-Sheikh for my uncle. I asked my mama what is off limits, the details of his death, its aftermath. He was a creature of the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea. They both were, the three of us. She tells me he was afraid to hold me. When he'd visit, he would come into the bedroom, distanced, and observe my staccato movements, the soft spot pulsing. He died when I was a month old. البحر متوسط, البحر الأحمر. She tells me he used to swim so far out to sea, she thought he'd never return. She'd yell his name, her voice hoarse against the waves, and just as a public panic would spread along the coastline, he'd reappear, questioning their distress, aglow with a supernatural vigor. I'm going to read a poem called Our Lady of Zaitun. And it is one of the poems that I wrote in Natasha's class, which I mentioned before. And it is a litany, it's a prayer, and it's kind of a surrealist reimagining of that sort of breaks the idea in my brain that, and Narja said it's one of her faves, mine too. But it kind of broke the idea in my brain that just because I moved to America when I was 5, that there isn't sort of a version of me that never left, and kind of in a parallel universe that might still be in Cairo and experiencing these sort of rapturous prayers and gatherings that people who all belong to the same kind of persecuted group experience in the way that they share space together. And I wrote this poem after reading about a recurring Marian apparition. So the Marian apparitions are miracles, sightings of the Virgin Mary, and they happen all over the world, but Egypt has some of the most famous recordings of Marian apparitions. And this poem is written about Our Lady of Zaitun, which was a recurring Marian apparition that visited St. Mary's Coptic Church in the Zaitun district of Cairo, Egypt, between 1968 and 1971. And it's on page 19. Sorry, I haven't been saying the page numbers, but page 19 if you want to follow along. Our Lady of Zaitun. We pray for one another, for the donkey's endless braying, for every woman's safety restored. Our bodies older now. Technicolor doves heaving upward the heat. The collective trauma of knowing the heat. Bodies slack from all angles, eyes rolled up from poverty and rust, the heat. The threat of persecution that sent us so far away, we thought we'd never return. We did, but somehow different now. Our bodies loom and sway, release. The sky, a blanket arranged above iridescent floodlights, surrender wholly, release. The technicolor detail, more rare now, release. Chaotic migration from Syria and Lebanon, Libya, Upper Egypt, Sudan. The doves, angels now, released to England, America, Canada, the diaspora scattered now, released. Together, we raise limbs, stiff and paralytic, longing for some holy virgin's anointed grasp. God is a burial chamber, inscribed in relief, an ill-tempered womb throbbing. Mary, when you look for me in the streets of Zaitun, I won't be there. Not under your spectral robes, nor weaving a palm leaf crucifix in your courtyard. Still, will you pray for me in the churches of Cairo? Will you greet me at heaven's gate? Thank you. How are we on time? I don't know where I am right now. Are we good? I think we're good. Okay, there's a lot of God and kind of Christian iconography that runs through this text. Coptic Christianity is often either people don't know that there are indigenous Christians in the Middle East, or Coptic Christianity has sort of been oftentimes kind of perverted by Western ideas of Christianity. But Coptic Christians are an ethno-religious group that are indigenous to Egypt, and we have been persecuted probably since starting in the 1950s, but in the last 15 years or so, it has been particularly bad. And it's hard to really communicate, because I think that in America, we have such a fixed idea of what Christianity is. And in so many strange and interesting ways, indigenous Christian groups are oppressed by other Christians because they're either used as an example to persecute or to point a finger at people who Americans think are the bad guy. Coptic Christians often get tangled into a lot of Islamophobic rhetoric when white Christians say, like, look what these people are doing to the Christians in the Middle East. And there's really very little regard for the history of that country in particular. I mean, everyone learns about ancient Egypt, and so few people know what contemporary Egypt really looks like, and how the history of colonialism, how far it spans back between the Greeks and the Romans and the Arabs, and how that's really changed the Coptic identity. So when I was writing these poems, I was so scared that I wasn't the person to say these things out loud, because I never grew up in a Coptic community. I really always thought of like being Coptic is like an ethnicity. It wasn't necessarily like a religious identity for me. But when I sat to write these down, I realized that even though I don't necessarily feel like I am a capital C Coptic Christian, if I'm going to talk about the identity, there was no way that I couldn't talk about God and the Virgin, and how they are such integral pieces of how people deal with persecution when they turn and when they have nowhere else to turn, and how religion is, it can't be separated for Coptic people from their experience with persecution. And I needed to honor that. And this poem is called Overheard in a Living Room in Pennsylvania. And it's about 20 Coptic Egyptian men and one Ghanaian man who were beheaded on camera on a beach in Libya. And in 2015, ISIS released this 5-minute video to the American public. And it was one of those moments where people were like, well, look at what ISIS is doing. They're killing Christians abroad. And I don't know if this is controversial to say, so I might be canceling myself with the Coptic community. But the way that these men's lives were treated was they were immediately became sort of, they became martyrs. So they became the 21 Martyrs of Libya, and all this iconography popped up about them. And they became sort of these symbols, these like religious symbols of believing in and standing up for your Christianity. And I had never seen their names. They were always just known as the 21 Martyrs of Libya. And I remember growing up and hearing snippets of this from the news channels that my parents would watch on Dish Network. If you're familiar with Dish Network, then you will probably know. Doesn't always work. But so I wrote this poem for them, and also for my teenage self that was constantly hearing about what was happening in Egypt, but too afraid to really become invested in it, because I also lived in America. And it's really difficult to try to hold on to two cultures and political worlds that are falling apart simultaneously. So this is Overheard in a Living Room in Pennsylvania. Something about 21 martyrs in a slow line walking, about rabbits on a roof, about seabirds calling. Something about a steady migration, a slow march along coastline, waves crashing. Something about 21 martyrs in a slow line walking, a construction site kidnapping, about a vengeful slaying. Something about a church bombing, Palm Sunday, suicide bombers. Something about a permanent panic, about difficulty recalling, about the casualties rising. Something about 21 martyrs in a long line kneeling, about gunmen opening fire on a minibus in a monastery. Something about radical leaflets scattered amongst the bodies, about the fear of returning, about Cairo burning. Something about Protestants assuming Coptic persecution, about recontextualization, about Christians uniting. Something about justifying prejudice, about Arabic speakers, about a history disappearing. Something about orange jumpsuits bunching, about Samuel, Essa, Milad, their heads bowed and praying. Something about Bishoy, Mina, Corolos, the lift of the seabirds calling. Something about Luca, Tawadros, Semah, Magid, Ezet, their somnolent waiting. Something about Abu Nab, Hani, Samuel, about Matthew's eternal chanting. Something about Geber, Girigis, the name of my grandfather, Melik, Yusuf, Melik, meaning angel, faithful, merciless, waiting. Something about moving to America being less of a choice than I grew up assuming. Something about the way a neighbor flinches in sympathy when I tell him I am Coptic. Something about flinching. Something about sympathy. I'm going to read 16 Rabbits. It's a long poem. I think it clocks in at about 10 minutes. So I'm going to go get a glass of water to prepare, and I will be right back. Oh, yeah. Okay. Glass of water. Okay, I'm back. I keep forgetting to mute myself, and then I realize I'm making small sounds that only you make to yourself. Anyway, intimate moments. 16 Rabbits. I think it speaks for itself. Page 24, if you're following along. In every dream, I ask for my grandmother, she doesn't show. I mimic the bassy call of the lemon seller, the ululation of her favored deacon, no luck. In some dreams, she appears but is made of wax, a butcher knife in hand. Here, my grandmother is not my grandmother, but my memory's imitation. Night after night, my wax grandmother visits me, but I know who she isn't. In March of 1993, I turned 5. In April, we emigrated to America. My mother tells me it is my birthday present to live in this country, to thrive in America. She didn't know the winters could be this cold, this blindingly bright, this almighty. How could she? In a living room in Pennsylvania, his eyes pooling, my father yells, "They are all dogs," and I curl into myself. News of Coptic persecution clogs the airways and his sadness grows. The footage cuts before the beheadings, and I think those are not my father's final breaths drawn. But I'm wrong. They are. And they're mine too. I think he is safe here, away from the violence in Egypt. But I'm wrong. He isn't safe in America. Neither am I. My father curses everything in Arabic, rarely speaks in public. His prayer is private, and he buries his anguish in laughter. In this dream, I am a little girl leapfrogging rabbits through an alleyway in Cairo. I search for my grandmother. Behind me, a man in a lab coat keeps pace. I rummage beneath the palm trees, search for her in the coarse mane of the market. No luck. Sometimes the alleyway is behind an elementary school in New Jersey, a bar in Vietnam. Other times the alleyway vanishes and I'm drowning in the dense air of a suburban midnight. The man in the lab coat records each failure. He mumbles, and I carry that sound everywhere. It's the blizzard of 96, and I carve angels in the snow. I am dressed in a windbreaker and jeans. No snowsuit or gloves. After the angels came an unrelenting throb, a purpling of the skin, the insidious burn of the cold. My mother apologizes profusely, as if she could have known, as if she should have known. In a bar in Hanoi, two Vietnamese women gesture to touch my hair. I let them. I like it. Here, I am a tourist. I am not an immigrant, not a child of immigrants, a diversity marker, nor this country's pet. I walk around Westlake and wonder, how many Egyptian women have been to Vietnam? I lock eyes with the expats. I am not an expat, but I nod, I pretend. In this memory, I am a little girl, mouth ajar, counting plastic flamingos stuck crooked in New Jersey lawns. The only English word I know is no, and I use it often. Here, I am not Egyptian, not Coptic nor Middle Eastern, not American or Mediterranean or Syrian or Lebanese, not special, not yet. I am only 6 weeks migrated, 5 years old, a little girl examining the remains of rabbit pups tossed from the roof. In this memory, I am a little girl in a living room in Pennsylvania. The house is plush with the scents of cumin, incense, and myrrh. I sit cross-legged and listen as my father tells the story of the 16 rabbits. In his memory, he is 10 years old, youngish child with hair rumored white from a premature birth. He sits in the kitchen, collecting grains of rice wedged between the floorboards. His mother stumbles into the room, eyes as wide as spangled hives, and drags him outside to save the 16 rabbits. We kept them on an enclosure on the roof, he tells me. We butchered and ate a rabbit a day. That day, on their rooftop in Cairo, the enclosure had come loose, allowing the rabbits free reign of the roof. It was covered in rat poison. Your grandmother hid it in bread to kill the rats. When he tells this story, my father laughs and laughs as he recounts the image of my grandmother chasing the poisoned rabbits with a butcher knife to put them out of their misery or save their meat. He describes their human-like screams, and then their bodies fallen from the roof and into the alleyway below. We never raised rabbits again. There's a metaphor here. some allegory I can mine for this poem, but the image of my grandmother bewildered on the roof overrides everything. Outside, the church bells ring at noon. Our neighbors ask for penance, pray for luck, ingest the sacrament. They are all dogs, he scoffs, and I lie in that wound. I touch my palm to it gently and let the blood stain my fingers. I do not deny him his feelings. I am not cruel. I am never alone. I do my dishes in the dark. I never question anything. I do not know what home is. I am from my parents' house. I do not speak my mother tongue. I only speak my mama's tongue. I am never late nor sorry. I am not a rabbit. I am not soft or tender or sensitive to touch. I am not my father's daughter, confused by the slaughter. This is not freedom. In this dream, my father and I search for a sewing needle and find it tucked between the photo albums of our early childhood. From the drain, we pull a long strand of my grandmother's hair, silver and black, and thread the needle. My father brings the edges of the wound together, and our pain bellows like the call of a lemon seller, her favored deacon, and together we sew. Thank you. Ah, we did it.
Wow, Maryan. Oh my gosh. It feels so, so good to, I mean, to hold your poems and to like enjoy your book as a book is so special. But, you know, Claire and I and the readers for tonight have seen these poems on the page take this shape, and it just is so, so wonderful to hear you read these poems and just like give us a performance. So thank you so much. Yeah, we are happy to do a little Q&A if we've got some comments in the chat. We don't have anything right now, but feel free to comment on the YouTube if you have any questions that you would like for us to ask this evening. Otherwise, I have a couple lined up that I was gonna resort to, but I also welcome our readers of this evening to chime in with any questions they might have about all of these 16 rabbits. While I wait for any questions that might come in, I want to mention this beautiful display that I labored over this evening. I first of all want to thank Malvern Books for hosting us virtually, and hopefully in the future, once we get through this pandemic together, we can all reconvene in the gorgeous Malvern Book space. But we do have 10 copies that are signed by Maryan waiting for you at Malvern Books. So if you're local, place that call for pickup. Come into the store. They no longer require appointments now that we're down to stage 2, which is such great news. And I did slide a couple of postcards into those copies over there. But we also have a few signed copies sitting behind me over here. It's not many, so you're going to want to make sure that you place your order as soon as possible, and I will make sure that they get shipped out on Monday or within 24 hours of you placing your order. Let me see. There we go. And yeah, you have to listen to the playlist. I know we kick off with like some very meditative, but like collage style folk with the what is it, the books, the I'm like blanking, I'm panicking. But I got so much work done listening to the playlist. So thank you, Maryan.
We have a question from Brittany in the chat. I'll go ahead and ask it if that's okay. Yes. And this is one that we actually put on the roster for our little backup questions because we thought it would be fun to hear this again. But Brittany says that Maryan shared a scene during the podcast conversation over on the host dispatch we asked her what the ideal setting to read 16 Rabbits would be, even a fantasy setting. Like, what's the ideal environment for this book to be read within? And yeah, Brittany's wondering if you could just share that with us in this space. And also, I'll just add to that and say, feel free to change it if you want. You don't have to say the same thing you said on the pod, but whatever you want, Maryan.
Okay. Am I on? Maybe. Am I spotlit? Can you see?
Yes.
Ooh. Okay. So on the podcast, I was kind of blown away by the question because it's sort of in a weird way kind of meta because all the poems are doing just that. Like the poems are set in a place and that place is really trying, it's distilled to its essence in a lot of ways. And so when I was asked that question, I was like, how do I set this scene? And my response was be somewhere that where you don't speak the language. So it doesn't have to necessarily be that you're abroad, but maybe you go to a community in your city where there are people who don't speak a language that you speak or understand, and sit outside and take in the rhythms of that language and sit with that confusion and the feeling of kind of not knowing maybe what's happening around you. I find that to be an incredibly valuable exercise. And I've done it many times. And some of the best work I've done as a writer has been in cafes in Montreal or in Barcelona, where like I don't speak the language. I'm really bad at learning languages. It's like very, it's hard for me to admit that because it's like my biggest shame. So yeah, sit in a cafe in a neighborhood or even just at a restaurant where you don't speak the language of the people who work there. Smoke something. That is like the ideal. Like you're smoking something. It can be a shisha, which is traditional, or hookah, depending on which term you prefer. You could be smoking a cigarette. I love smoking cigarettes. Mom, I see you in the chat. Please don't kill me. But it's really good for my, the kind of ritual of bringing the cigarette up and putting it down is like very, very meditative to me. I don't drink though. So like, I don't know, maybe that balances it out. And I said that it would be ideal if it was like mid-October, which could mean anything depending on where you are in the world. But something about mid-October just I feel like my truest self around that time of the year. And growing up in Pennsylvania, that is like when the weather, it is like the best weather, like fall, it's beautiful. West Philly, you're drinking your latte. But here in Texas, sometimes it's still like really hot. So, and if you're in Australia, that's a whole nother game. So yeah, that was my answer. Thanks for asking.
We have someone commenting on the YouTube channel. It's not a question. It's from Shayna Fraser, who says, I don't have a question, but just wanted to say this was such a beautiful launch. Shout out to all the readers. And Maryan, you did the damn thing. Well, I want to ask you one more question, Maryan, and it is about the poem you just read for us, about the titular poem, 16 Rabbits.
Mhm.
And I'm especially intrigued now that I've heard you read it. But we have in that poem, it takes shape on the page in such an interesting way. And it also changed and evolved through the editorial process in a way that felt really organic and fascinating to observe for me. And we have these italicized lines that take place on the right side of the page and are kind of these callbacks to other poems. And I noticed you didn't read them in your reading. So that's why I said I'm extra curious to hear you speak about those lines now. And if you don't mind just telling us about how this poem kind of came to its final shape and how that, it feels right to me. I hope it feels right to you.
Yeah. It feels very right to me. And if for anybody curious, I can't see myself. This is why I'm like struggling to be graceful. Here we go. So they're in italicized. There are lines that are pulled from other poems that are italicized and they're kind of shifted to the side. Some of them are longer than others, but as I was practicing, like reading these poems and preparing, I realized that there are aspects of this book that feel that they can only really be read. And I wanted to honor that because for me, this also calls back Our Lady of Zaitun, which has the heat, and then later it says release on the side too. And those moments feel kind of like these ghosts that kind of haunt 16 rabbits in that poem. And I didn't want to materialize those ghosts. I felt like they are only really meant to haunt the poem and not necessarily, or rather the written on the page poem and not necessarily be read. And also what I really like about them, and maybe this is something I'll have to practice with reading, is that they feel like 16 Rabbits, the poem is dreams, it's memories, it's like deep shame and feeling. But it's also all these like callbacks to images that we've seen in previous poems, both in the main text, right? Like when we describe the living room in Pennsylvania, it is described in the same way that it is in the meditation in York, Pennsylvania. But it's also these sort of ghost lines that are kind of floating around. And it felt like I had to just honor that they're meant to exist only on the page. And when I first, because this poem is it's the longest poem I've ever written easily. But it's also very difficult because it's narrative in a way that my other poems just aren't. And I had a really difficult time telling the story of the 16 rabbits. Like, how do I do this in a way where it's not verbatim? How do I do it in a way where it is clear what's happening in this scene and the chaos of it? And just like, what a crazy image of these rabbits in an enclosure, breaking out of the enclosure, eating this bread, getting poisoned with rat poisoning, and then like dying and flinging themselves off of a roof. Like, mind-blowing. And it's not the only rabbit story that my dad has told. And so when I was thinking about like, when I brought this sort of rough cut of this poem, I was like, I need you to make this make sense for an audience that isn't my mom and my dad and my sister. And sometimes I think about the way that my dad specifically tells stories and the way that Egyptian people tell stories and how they're different than the way that American people tell stories, whether it's in the way that levity is woven through it, or even just the order of events and how they're communicated. And so I was trying to find a balance where I was like, okay, if I'm going to call the book 16 Rabbits, I have to get the story correct. And I really struggled with it. But Claire, like, you were my beacon of light. And I feel like I only could really find it when basically you and Anar were like, we love you, but this is confusing. And I was like, I know, help me. And I'm so proud of it now, because even like the first part, the characters were different, and the grandmother became a central part of the title poem. And my grandmother wasn't in that poem nearly as much as she is now. And now it just feels so much more connected to the full book, because there are books that feel like collections of poems that are brought together. And then there are books like this that like every single poem is meant to be read with all these other poems. Like it is a book length work in so many ways. Yeah.
I have another question from the YouTube chat from Justin Bowie. They say, this reading was so good. I'm so interested in hearing about the process. Are there any standout moments in the process of writing the poems for this collection that inspired you?
Yeah, I think that I talk a lot. Everyone who knows me knows this. I've always been a verbal processor. Like every time an idea comes to my brain, I have to talk about it. Like I can't just write it down. And my partner is amazing at supporting that. And sometimes it gets annoying, I know, but there have been trips that we've gone on, like the poem Meditation in Guanajuato, which is about me almost drowning in the Pacific Ocean, which is a true story. It was one of the scariest moments of my life. Brian, my partner, was there with me, and he watched me save myself as I heard the voice of God. And the voice of God told me that I need to save myself. And I remember swimming to the shoreline, and I hadn't eaten all day. In fact, it was sunset. So probably like 6 or 7, and we hadn't eaten all day, and my sugar crashed and I was like blacking out. And he was like carrying me back to our Airbnb we were in this coastal town called Sayulita. And I remember I laid down and I like asked him to buy me food, but I like couldn't communicate properly because my brain was just like smush. And he left, and he had gone and like got himself tacos and was like watching a band because he thought that I was just going to go to sleep. And I remember crying and crying and crying and like really feeling like I just had a near-death experience in a way that I'd never had before. And then he came back and he brought me, I like messaged him and I was like, I need food. And he brought me back 6 tacos. And I remember eating those tacos like a wild animal, like just covered in them. And we were staying in this like bungalow that had an outdoor kitchen, and it was Christmas Eve, just like the poem says. And there were fireworks going off everywhere. Like everyone in the neighborhood was shooting off fireworks, and they had been doing karaoke from sun up to sundown. And it was just very like festive all around us. And I was processing this like deeply traumatic experience. And Brian and I are like hugging as he's like comforting me. And this firecracker comes flying out from next to us and literally circles us and like smashes against the ceramic angel that was hanging by the door next to the bedroom, and smashes the ceramic angel. And I was like, I'm pretty sure God is real. I was like, this is the moment where it's like very clear that God is real. And we spent the rest of the trip talking about the dogs that we were seeing everywhere in Mexico. Everywhere we were going, there's just dogs everywhere. And it was just stunning to me. But then also we spent the rest of the trip just talking about like this near-death experience and this unreal experience of not knowing my whole life whether or not God was real, but then hearing a voice in my head that wasn't mine and experiencing this thing on Christmas Eve, right? Like it's almost like truth is stranger than fiction, right? And that was the first time that I started to really think about prayer and really think about what it means for me to reevaluate what it means to be an American who speculates or who question, what's the word that I want? That's skeptical of God's existence, because Americans are skeptical of so many things. And like, what would it mean to maybe just believe in God for a year and pray and think about miracles and angels? And that was sort of that moment of nearly dying, which I didn't tell my mom about for like 2 years, because I was like, mom's going to kill me for almost dying. But that was really a huge moment where I started to understand where my voice was and what I needed to do. Thank you, Justin. Hi. Justin's a great friend.
It doesn't seem like we have any more questions this evening. Maryan, is there anything that you want your audience to know this evening? Anything you want to add?
Thank you for being here. And thank you for letting me be myself. It's really hard to be yourself, but I think with this pandemic that we've all lived through, it has created bonds between us in ways that I don't think could ever have happened. And I've never felt more comfortable to just be myself. And I am really grateful to have a community that supports that and celebrates it. And I wouldn't have been able to write these poems and actually share them with strangers. I mean, this is so intimate. Like any book, any art that you're putting in front of an audience is intimate, but like this feels like I'm married to all of you now, like we're all married. All of my feelings. And yeah, to anyone who hasn't read the book yet, but is interested in it, and has questions or, wants a friend to read it with, I will read it with you. Is that weird? That's weird. I take that back. Thank you, Anar and Joe and Claire, and Brittany and Molly and Rob and Gabby. I love you all. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Maryan. This was the perfect evening.
Yeah, it was.
Great job.